How does a halachic mind interpret the harrowing events at Masada, where Jewish rebels chose death at their own hands over surrender? In this class, we delve into this question, exploring not only the tragic case at Masada, but also similar ethical dilemmas faced by Jews during the Middle Ages when confronted with forced conversions under Christian rule. The complexities of these historic moments offer deep insights into the moral and spiritual struggles that have shaped Jewish resilience and identity. There used to be a journal that was published by the religious wing of the Israeli military under the auspices of the Israeli chief rabbi called Machanayim. And in 1958, in the issue of Yud Zayin Cheshvan Tafshin Yud Tes, there was a question, an Ask the Rabbi question, that was presented in this journal Machanayim. And although the answer, the one who's writing the answer to this question, his name isn't provided there in the journal, but we know quite well that the one who's going to answer this question is going to be Rabbi Shlomo Goren. Rabbi Shlomo Goren in 1958 is the chief rabbi of the Israeli military. Later, in the 1970s, he becomes eventually the Ashkenazi chief rabbi in Israel. But again, this is in 1958, and the question is asked by a person from Switzerland whose name is Yoav Alstein, and he writes the following to the journal Machanayim. He writes the following to Rabbi Goren. Sha'alu she'ela oidois ha'halacha al parshas gvuras Masada. They asked the question here. He's in a Bnei Akiva type of camp or group in Switzerland. And a question was raised at one of their meetings about the story of heroism at Masada. In a nutshell, because we don't want to do too much of this more than necessary today. Story of Masada in a nutshell. After the Churban Bayis, a few years thereafter, there was still a group of Jews who were holding out against the Romans in the Judean desert on top of a big mountain or some other it was a fortress that was built on top of a mountain. And ultimately, they took their own lives and the lives of their families rather than falling into the hands of the Romans. That is the story in very brief. And in Israeli history, already in the beginning of the 20th century, maybe even a little before, definitely in the 1950s, this is a story that is regarded positively by Israeli society. It may not be so today, but I'm saying what was then. And it was considered to be a very important example and about the need for independence and to live freely, etc., etc. So it was a story that resonated in that particular time. So everyone is talking about Masada in the 1950s. There was already an archaeological dig that happened. There was going to be archaeological digs that happened later in the 1960s. And so therefore, it's not surprising that the question comes up in a Bnei Akiva setting where they want to follow halacha. How do we take that story and think about it through a halachic lens? Now, this is not just a theoretical question Yoav asks. Yesh bazeh gam inyan chinuchi. It's an educational question. Im liroy says, Geborei Masada be'or chiyuv yishalem. Should we look at them as completely positive? Or with certain hesitations, reservations, saying, yes, but maybe not everything that went on over there is compatible with halacha. This is the question that he asked Rabbi Shlomo Goren. Rabbi Shlomo Goren penned a response that was published in this journal in Machanayim, Yud Zayin Cheshvan Tafshin Yud Tes. And Rabbi Goren, in his response, turned to a number of sources. We're not going to look at all of them. A number of the sources that he looked at were from the Rishonim in Ashkenaz. So we're going to now look at some of these Rishonim that he quoted from the medieval period. Some of which he quoted, some he didn't quote it. But we're going to introduce the topic and the sources by turning to another tshuva. This is a tshuva of Maharam Rottenburg. Maharam Rottenburg lives in Worms. He's from the Great Rishonim, from the Balei HaTosfos, lives in the late 1200s, passes away in the early 1300s. And in his collection of tshuvas, there is the following very tragic question that was posed. Yehudi echad sha'al es Maharam sheyichya, a Jew asked Maharam, im tzarich kapara, whether he needs to have a kapara, an atonement, for the following act. What was the act? Al shashachat ishtoi v'daled banav, he murdered his wife and 4 of his children. How would such a thing happen? B'yoim hereg rav b'kublinch. On a day of a mass massacre in Koblenz. We know that this is Koblenz. It's a place in Germany today. It's about 125 kilometers from Worms. The Maharam was living in Worms, so it's not too far from there. And he calls it Ir Hadamim, the city of blood. In other words, there was a very well-known massacre of Jews that happened over there, and so it gets the name Koblenz Ir Hadamim. And the Encyclopedia Judaica in the entry of Koblenz, it says over there that on the 2nd of April, 1265, there was a massacre of Jews over there, and they also are mitzayin to this tshuva of Maharam Rottenburg, and they say that they think that this that this tshuva here refers to that incident over there. So there was a massacre of Jews that happened in Koblenz in 1265 on the 2nd of April. So what happened over here? Instead of non-Jews taking the lives of these Jews, he took the lives of these Jews, his family members, kikach bikshuhu, because they asked of him to do this. Why did they ask of him to do this? Yan ra'u, they saw ki yatsa hakesef melishnei Hashem, that God was, so to speak, in wrath. In other words, they saw that the end was near. The non-Jews, whoever they were coming and attacking. And v'yischilu ha'ovim la'arog b'nei ke'el chai hanerogim al kiddush Hashem. They're already murdering Jews al kiddush Hashem. And why are they jumping the gun, so to speak? The reason they're doing that, as we're soon going to see, there was sometimes a fear that every Jew was offered an opportunity. If they are baptized, if they convert, then they're going to be saved. And how do I know that when I face that opportunity, I'm going to actually make the right choice? So therefore, the wife, and in this case the children, turn to the husband and say, why don't we take care of this right now, so that I don't have to face the Nisayan. That's what happened over here. He also planned to take his own life in this way. So indeed, he took the lives of his wife and children. He tried to do so for himself, and in circumstances that are not entirely clear, he survived. Perhaps he tried to injure himself, didn't do so effectively, and then the non-Jews came and saved him. And obviously, the person is horrified. It's a personal tragedy. But in addition to that, we know that when someone, let's say in the Middle Ages, if a Jew was involved, b'shoigig, inadvertently in the death of a fellow Jew, they would turn to the Rabbanim and they would ask for a kapara. What could they do to atone? And we have in Shuvas where there would be responses, and they were very harsh. You had to go and live in a different city, you had to go into Golos and many dozens of fasts, and you couldn't wear certain clothes, and a whole list of behaviors that a person needed to do in order to atone, and it was very often also enforced by the community, which, remember, the community has the power to enforce these types of things. So that's the question that's over here. They want to know, what are they supposed to tell? What is this Jew supposed to do? What should they advise this Jew to do given this very tragic situation? This is the question that comes to Maharam Rottenburg in the year, again, assuming the Encyclopedia Judaica's guess is correct, that this is in the year 1265. So Maharam Rottenburg, in order to answer this question, says, let us go back in time and let us look in the Tanakh, in the story in Sefer Shmuel, of the fall of Shaul HaMelech. Because, as the Pasuk says, in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Lamed Aleph, it speaks about a war that Shaul is engaging in with the Plishtim. Vatichbad HaMolchama El Shaul, and the war became really difficult for him. Vayimsa'uhu HaMoirim Anoshim Bakoshes, and the archers located him. Those are the people with the bows and arrows. They figured out where Shaul was. He was very afraid of the archers Shaul was. And at that point, Vayomer Shaul in Noisei Chelav, so Shaul told his arms bearer, Shloif Charbecha, take your sword, Vidakreniva, and run me through with it, stab me. Pen Yavayu ha'arelim ha'ela, lest these uncircumcised people come utkaruni and will stab me, v'his alaluvi, and they will abuse me, torture me. V'loy ava Noisei Chelav, but the arms bearer wasn't willing to do this. Ki yarei ma'oid, he was very afraid. The pasuk is vague. He was afraid of what? Afraid of the act, afraid of Hashem, thinking that this was wrong, or afraid of some other thing. Sometimes, generally, fear paralyzes a person and makes them unable to do anything. So vayikach Shaul es hacherev. So Shaul took the sword, vayipol aleha, and he fell on his sword. And the pasuk continues saying that Vayar Noisei Chelav Kimei Shaul, and the arms bearer noticed and then realized that Shaul had died. So what do we see over here? That Shaul HaMelech, this very important figure of Jewish history, his life came to an end by him taking it on his own. This is what the Psukim describe. Now the question is, how are we supposed to think about this behavior of Shaul? How are we supposed to understand the behavior of Shaul? Maharam Rothenburg tells us that in order to answer this question with the Jew in the Middle Ages, we need to understand how to think about this in terms of Shaul. So he points to a medrash. The medrash tells us on a pasuk in Parshas Noach after the flood, Bereishis Perek Tes, that says as follows: Va'ach es dimchem lenafshoseichem edrosh. On a very simple pshat level, what this pasuk is saying is, Hashem just permitted animal consumption. A human being is allowed to take the life of an animal and consume it. That was said immediately prior to this. So therefore the Torah now comes and says, hold on, just because the taking of the life of an animal is permitted, hold on, I'm going to go after you for taking human life. And the pasuk then specifies, if an animal kills a human being, there's going to be consequences for the animal. Sometimes in Torah, an animal that's involved in the murder of a human being is actually executed judicially. There's also some Mefarshim say, well, maybe Hashem will just make a gzera, that if an animal did that, then another animal will come and take the life of the animal. And likewise, if it's a human being, if it's an Adam, if it's a person taking the life of a fellow ish achiv, a fellow person, God is going to come after it. I'm not going to let it go unpunished. There's going to be consequences for the taking of human life. On a very basic level, that is what this pasuk is saying, and numerous pashtanim understand it in that way. However, we know that when it comes to psukim, there's always a pshat level, and then there's also drush. And we have a medrash on this pasuk. We're quoting now from Bereishis Rabbah, Parsha Lamed Daled. Says the medrash Rabbah, Ach, the pasuk that has the word Ach, is lahavi as hachoinek atzmoi. This actually comes to add a new prohibition that actually isn't clear in any one of the psukim in the Torah. There's no clear pasuk in the Torah that says the taking of one's own life is prohibited. Of course, on a basic level, you say, well, it's part of lo sirtzach. What's the difference? My life, someone else's life. But at the end of the day, you don't have a clear pasuk that is coming specifically to this issue of a person, God forbid, taking their own life. Says the Medrash, we do have that pasuk. Where is that pasuk? It's this pasuk in Parshas Noach. Because when it says, Va'aches dimchem lenafsheseichem edrosh, and I'm going to interpret this the way the Mefarshim of the Medrash tell us to interpret it, it's not a derivation from the word Va'ach. It's a derivation of this whole clause. Va'aches dimchem lenafsheseichem. When you do it to yourself, lenafsheseichem, dimchem, your blood, lenafsheseichem, your soul, when you do it to yourself, edrosh. Hashem says there's going to be a consequence for that. And obviously that type of consequence isn't here in Olam Hazeh, that's in the other world in Olam Haba, and some of the Mefarshim explain indeed the pasuk to refer to that. This is what the pasuk means. This is what the Medrash Rabbah tells us. Ach lahavi es hachoinek atzmai, a person who takes their own life, even if there isn't a loss of blood, by the way, even if it's done through strangulation, where it isn't dimchem, but remember it's lenafshay seichem. And again, that's how the Mefarshim tell us to understand this particular pasuk. Now the Medrash continues to the more controversial part. Yachel kishaol. So a person could think like Shaul. So I'm going to tell you the first way we're going to learn this Medrash. And the way, the first source, the earlier the sources that we're going to relate first, learn it in the following way. Yachol kashol, you're going to tell me that maybe Shaul was wrong. Yachol kashol, that Shaul is included in the Isser. You would have a thought that Shaul's behavior was wrong. Talmud Leimer ach. Ach is a miut. And many times a pasuk that says the word ach comes to tell us there's actually an exception. It's like a minus sign that tells you there's something that gets subtracted from the equation here. And who is it? It's Shaul. Shaul is okay. Why? The Medrash doesn't say. The Medrash doesn't say why Shaul is okay. But this is how the Rishonim are going to understand this Medrash. And Maharam understands the Medrash in this way, and he brings this Medrash. The Maharam is not the first one to bring this Medrash and to cite this Medrash and to tell us that Shaul was permitted for doing what he did. Other Rishonim who came before Maharam and Rothenberg from the same region also told us this. And when we read what they have to say, we'll also understand why Shaul is considered an exception. So we're actually going to learn about these Rishonim by going away from Ashkenaz and going to Sfard, because the Ritva, who lived in Spain in the 1300s, he had access to the Tosfos, and he sometimes quotes the Tosfos. And he quotes the Tosfos in Masechtas Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Ches, and he writes as follows: Kasuv b'Gil Yainei HaTosfos. The Tosfos, remember, the Tosfos is the writings of Chachmei Ashkenaz and France in the 1100s and the 1200s. So the Ritva, writing in the 1300s, has this already. The works of Tosfos have made their way into Sfard, and they're being quoted now. Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbi Yaakov Tam, Rashi's Einukol, who lived in the 1100s in France, said as follows: when a person is afraid that he's going to be forced to convert, then he's allowed to self-wound. He's allowed to self-wound. Where do I know that from? Because I get it from the Medrash. The Medrash says, Pirush. What does that mean? Why did Shaul take his life? So if I asked you, based on the Psukim, what's the reason? I think you would say he didn't want to be tortured, he didn't want to be captured. I think that would be the most straightforward reading of the Psukim. Well, Rabbeinu Tam tells us not to read it that way. You want to know why Shaul did what he did? Pirush shachav ba'atzmai mipnei shahara misyare shema yaviru al das. Shaul was afraid that they were going to force him to become a Philistine pagan. And that's why he did what he did. Do they point to a word in the pasuk that shows us that? No. But this is how they learned the story of Shaul. Or in other words, Rabbeinu Tam was deeply bothered by the idea that someone could say, "Oh, I'm about to die, I'm suffering, so let me expedite this process on my own." No, Rabbeinu Tam says it cannot be. We cannot understand the story of Shaul in that way. So it must be something else. What's the something else? For deep religious conviction, for something as serious as Avodah Zarah, something as serious as conversion. That is why Shaul did it. You would think that's wrong. Talmud Leimer ach miet. There's a miot here. That in such cases it is mutter. So when Maharam is quoting Shaul, really Maharam isn't innovating anything here. Maharam is echoing the words of Rabbeinu Tam that was said a century earlier. Rabbeinu Tam already said Shaul did it for the purpose of not doing Avodah Zarah, and it was mutter, number one. Number two, Rabbeinu Tam said that's relevant to us, living in the 1100s, when the first crusade happens, the second crusade happened, when these forms of persecution happen, and a Jew says, you know something, I have that same fear Shaul has, then it is permitted for them to do this act. And so therefore, coming back to our case over here, the story of this Jew that Maharam is addressing, regarding his attempt to take his own life, at least that, there's precedent here in Ashkenaz to say that this indeed is going to be a big exception to this rule. Generally, this is not allowed. Here is exception where it becomes allowed. Now the Tosfos continues. The Ritva quoting the Tosfos continues. And from here we derive to take it a step further. Not only to take one's own life, but there's actually, from here, we've taken a lesson. What about the children? So the children, if the adults go and the children survive, if all the adults go on Kiddush Hashem and the children survive, what's going to happen? They're just going to take them. They're not even going to give them a choice. They're going to kill the adults. The adults are going to go on Kiddush Hashem. They're going to take these children. How are these children going to grow up? They're going to grow up like Christians, and then they're going to be persecuting Jews in a few years from now. So mothers and fathers were thinking about that, and they were horrified by that. So they said, well, if it's permitted to do it to yourself, then why is it not permitted to do it to them as well? Whether you want to say it's b'toiras shlichus, or however you want to formulate what the legal logic here is, he doesn't do that. But he just says from here, they took that next step to say it's okay to do it to your family. Or to come back to the story of Maharam, all of a sudden, the behavior that he did to his wife and his children now is granted some legitimacy over here in this teaching from Rabbeinu Tam. Says the Ritva, Ad kan matzasi begil yainei atosis. I just finished quoting not what I think. I finished quoting what I found in Tosis. Says the Ritva, now his own voice kicks in. V'hein dvarim shetzrichin Talmud v'iyun gadol. I'm not so sure. This needs more study. This is something that we can't be flippant about. And then he goes weiter and says, Ella, although I would like to hit the pause button on this, but kfar hoira is okay. Rabbeinu Tam said this is okay. And if Rabbeinu Tam said this is okay, Rabbeinu Tam is a legend. So am I really going to come and start disagreeing? And then he goes further and says, and not only Rabbeinu Tam said this, V'shamanu b'shein gedoylei tzarfas, we heard in the names of the great sages of France, she'itiru ken halach l'maisa, that it wasn't only theoretical, that halach l'maisa this came up, and that Rabbanim said that this is mutter, that this is permissible. And indeed, the lashon mikan loindin lishchot. I mean, it's a little horrifying, that lashon, because if you think about it, it's written in lashon hoiva, like not something of the past. This from here, we learn, meaning the French rabbis are speaking, to do this type of thing. Okay, so obviously, when we read this, you're supposed to be upset. You're supposed to be angry. At the very least, angry that we live in a world that forces people to make this type of these horrific decisions. But this is one of the symptoms of galus, a long galus that's gone on for very long. And now we see what Maharam Rottenberg is going to be referring to, what he's going to be leaning on when he's going to address this case. Now, till now, we saw the Ritva quoting Rabbeinu Tam. What if you open our Gemaras and you look at our Tosfos in Avodah Zarah? So we also find Rabbeinu Tam's voice there. Remember, Tosfos is not one book. There are many different collections of Tosfos from many different yeshivas and schools, and while there are some parallels between them, there are also differences between them. And the Tosfos that landed on the page in the printed Gemara happens to be just one particular Tosfos. So let's look at our Tosfos. Tosfos Shalanu, Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. Let's see how Rabbeinu Tam is quoted here. Omer Rabbeinu Tam says, when they're afraid that the non-Jews are going to force the Jew to do the Aveira, they're going to torture. And then the Jew basically is going to say, Mele, you took my life, fine. I'm ready to do that, not to serve Avodah Zarah. After all, the din is, I'm ready to die, but you're not killing me. You're torturing me, torture. How much torture could a human being take? So when a person is afraid of that, then it's a mitzvah lach b'matzmai. Mitzvah here doesn't mean commandment. Mitzvah here means, he didn't want to use the word mutter, as in to say it's just permitted. He wanted to say, and it's a good thing. Mutter, it's a good thing, not a chiyuv, so he's using the word mitzvah for that. I think that's how this is generally understood. But here it's interesting. He brings a different source. How do I know this? So it's the same psak din. It's the same psak din, basically. But what's his source? His source is Kahi de Gittin Gabe Yeladim, the story of the children in Maseches Gittin. Before we come to the story in Maseches Gittin, we'll see that in a second. Let me just notice one nuance here. It doesn't say Havaras Lavar Al Das here, which sounds like conversion. It says Pen Yavinu La Aveira. La Aveira. So the question is how to understand the word La Aveira. To me, it's very clear, based on when you judge this against all the other parallels, that it's the same thing. La Aveira means the Aveira, the ultimate Aveira of conversion, as opposed to any other specific Aveira. I have a hard time believing that the meaning of Tosfos here is that. As I said before, all the other parallels, and there are a number of parallel passages, have, as we just saw before, Yachrichu al das, Achtos Hashem, Yichud Hashem, language like that. So I don't think we should read Avera as any Avera. We should read Avera as the ultimate Avera. Okay, now this Tosfos tells us we're going to learn it from where? We're going to learn it from the story of the 400 children. So the Ritvas Rabbeinu Tam derived it from where? Derives it from Shaul. Our Rabbeinu Tam derives it from the story of the 400 children. What's the Maisa? Gemara Gittin Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. There's a story of 400 children, boys and girls, who nishbu lekoloin, or lekloin. They were captured for something shameful. In other words, they were going to become sex slaves in Rome. Both the boys and the girls. Here, Girshu ba'atzma lama hein misbakshin. They figured out what's going on over here. Kafsu kulam v'naflu l'saych hayam. So first it says that the girls went ahead and the girls jumped into the sea. They took their own lives and they jumped into the sea. Then the boys made a kal v'chomer and they said, if the girls did that, and they, in their view, it would be much worse if a boy were subjected to this than a girl were. And alpha became the girls went ahead and took their lives, so we should as well. And they did this kal v'chomer and afheim kafzu l'soich hayam. This is the Gemara in Gittin. It's a very famous sugya where for a few blat the Gemara describes events associated with the Churban Bayis. And so therefore this story, we can date it basically, presumably, to the era of the Churban Bayis, when the Romans were taking many people over to Rome. And in this particular case, for very, very immoral purposes. And Rabbeinu Tam says, I'm willing in the 1100s to draw a parallel and look at that as precedent. What did they do? They basically said, we don't want to be involved in Arroyas, even in a way of Oinus. We're not interested. Arroyas, Gila Arroyas, we're not interested. And what do? They took their own lives to avoid Gila Arroyas. So why can't a person do the same thing for Avodah Zarah? I don't want to do Avodah Zarah. I don't want to be put in a situation where I'm going to end up doing Avodah Zarah, or that I'm going to be tortured into doing it, or I'm not going to have the strength, when I'm all alone and they isolate me from the rest of the group and then they give me that choice. Maybe I won't have the strength. And so therefore, I want to learn from these children who did it for Gila Arayis. I want to do it for Avodah Zarah. After all, many times in the Torah, Gila Arayis and Avodah Zarah are equated one with the other. They can be placed in the same boat. And this is what I want to do. Says Rabbeinu Tam, that this is mitzvah. Again, I'm interpreting mitzvah to mean not only it's mutter, but it's actually something laudatory. It's something praiseworthy. Okay. Now there's another Tosfos. The other Tosfos is right here in Maseches Gittin. Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. He stellt sich on these words, Kafstu kulon v'naflu l'soich hayam. And again, here is Tosfos in our Gemara. It's printed in Gittin Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. Although we learn also in the Gemara that it's forbidden for a person to take their own life. So what's going on over here? How could these children do this? And for Tosfos, Hacha Yereim Hayu Miyasurim. Here they were afraid of torture. Kidam Rinan, as we say in Gemara Ksubos, Ilmale Nagdu Lechananya Mishal Varazarya Pochu Litzalma. Had the Babylonians tortured, whipped Hananya, Mishael, and Azariah, these are people who refused to serve idols. But had they been tortured to serve idols, they would have. Because torture, in a sense, is more difficult than death. Death is death. But torture a person again and again and again until you force them to do this particular act, even Hananya, Mishael, and Azariah would not have been able to withstand this Messiah. And so therefore, in this case, why was it okay to do this? Because they were afraid of Yisurim. How are we supposed to understand these words? They were afraid of Yisurim. Well, on the most basic level, we have to remember all the other parallel passages in the Rishonim about this that we're seeing. It doesn't just mean they were afraid of Yisurim, torture in and of itself. There's a continuation to the sentence. They were afraid of Yisurim that was going to lead them to do Avodah Zarah. That's the heter over here. And this is going to make a very, very big difference. And the reason it's so clear that this is what Tosfos is saying is because that's why he brings the Gemara in Ksubas. Just like Hananya and Mishael and Azariah with Yisurim would have ended up bowing to the idol, so too there are Jews who we live with today who are afraid that with Yisurim they're going to end up bowing to the modern idol, whatever it is, however Avodah Zarah is worshipped in the Middle Ages. And so therefore, this becomes permission, a mutter. a heter. The aid. Then Tosfos says there's another reason why it was okay for them to go ahead, because the al karchach hayu ma'aninoisam, v'loy hayu organoisam. They would have just raped them, and they wouldn't have even killed them. In other words, if you tell someone, you have to be willing to die. So the person says, okay, I'm willing to die. I'm willing to die not to do the Aveira. They wouldn't have had that choice here. You could have told all these kids, by the way, just be willing to die. Okay, I'm willing to die. They're going to take you. They're not going to kill you. Not even going to give you that chance. And they're just going to persecute you and rape you. So what's your out? There is no out. In other cases, you could say your out is you will stand the torture until they say, if you're not going to do this, we're going to kill you. And then you say, fine. And then you went on Mesidas Nefesh. You're allowed, God forbid, your life to be taken. But over here, we wouldn't even have that. And so these kids didn't have any way. It was basically inevitable. Again, in a case in Avodah Zarah, you could say, there's two choices. I could either serve Avodah Zarah or I could die. So comes Seder and says, allow yourself to die and be killed. Here you don't even have two choices. They're going to take them and they're going to rape them. And so there was no out. And so therefore, that rule of don't do it doesn't apply. And so it became mutter for them to go ahead and do this act. So in summary, what did we so far see? We saw three different versions of Tosfos. We saw a Tosfos in Gittin, we saw a Tosfos in Avodah Zarah, and we saw Ritva's version of the Tosfos in Avodah Zarah. And what's the bottom line? The common denominator between these three, that although, yes, there is a prohibition against, God forbid, a person taking their life, there is a narrow exception. What's the narrow exception? How would we word it? How would we phrase it? We would phrase it around Gila Aroyas. We would phrase it around Avodah Zarah, that if a person wants to ensure that they're not going to end up doing those things, which the din is, Yeharag Val Yaver, that you should allow yourselves to be killed. But if for whatever reason you're afraid that you're not going to have the koyach or whatever the beer is, that it's going to end up happening and that you're going to succumb. So then the person, according to this shitta, has the right to go ahead and to preempt, so to speak, and do this on his own. And so therefore, Maharam writing in the... and moreover, we also saw that it carried over. In one of these three sources, we saw the Ritva telling us that, by the way, this is not just for yourself. Once it's permitted for yourself, it carries over for the family as well. So Maharam Rothenburg is aware of all this, and let's see how he therefore presents the answer to this particular Jew who asked this question in the year 1265. So Maharam begins his response saying, Lo yadana shaper ma'i doimbe. I don't really know what to say about you. Why does Maharam not really know what to say? So he says like this. There's a part of this that's easy, and there's a part that's a little more difficult. What's the easy part? Someone who took their own life because their objective was to remain loyal to Achdas Hashem and to remain Jewish. So he falls in line with Rabbeinu Tam Shitta, with the three Tosfosim that we saw. He falls in line 100%. And he quotes the teaching from Shaul, and he quotes the teaching of the 400 children. And so therefore that's not controversial. So then why is there an issue here? Because remember how Ritva seamlessly quoted Rabbeinu Tam, transferring from oneself to someone else? That's where Maharam says, really? Let's see what he says. Where's your source? Where's your source to say this mutter? The 400 kids, it's not one doing it to the other. Shaul, at least in terms of what actually happened, he did it to himself. So where's your source to say that someone could do it for us? He says, I'm not sure. However, so in other words, he's leaning now in a direction to basically say it's a no-no, right? However, before he does that, he gets pulled back. Miu davar zeh pashat hatera. Oh, there's a widespread heter about this. Maharam is living in the late 1200s. He knows what's been going on in Ashkenaz for the last 200 years, from time to time when there's been a persecution against the Jewish community. They were great Jews. And in fact, it's reflected in our liturgy, he tells us. In the kinos that we say on Tisha B'Av, Kina number Chavtes. It begins with the word Amarti She'umi Meni. It's a description of massacres of Jews in Europe Probably this is referring to the First Crusade. Why am I saying probably it refers to the First Crusade? Because in the acrostic for this kina, it's in our collection of kinas, which is a standard Ashkenaz collection. The acrostic at the end has his name. His name is Kloinimus Katan. Kloinimus HaKatan, I think. There's another piyut that we know for sure was written about the First Crusade that was written by a Kloinimus as well. So it's a good chance that it's written by the same one. Now in this other kina, which is kina Chaf Hey, is called Miyitein Roshi Mayim. He actually gives the dates over there of what happened. And because it's this time of year, so I might as well specify the dates. Again, this is in the piyut in kina Chaf Hey, Miyitein Roshi Mayim, where he writes that in the Jewish community of Spire, the Crusades, the first crusade in the year 1096, came on Ches Iyar and massacred Jews there. In Worms, they came on Chaf Gimel Iyar and Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and in Mainz on Gimel Sivan. So this Kloinimus presumably wrote the second kina, Amarti She'umi Meni, presumably going on this first crusade, again describing the events of the first crusade in the year 1096 in Germany, in the Rhineland. And over there, and I'm not going to quote it because it's enough. This is difficult enough. But if you read it, you'll see there are passages there that pretty clearly are referring to the fact that some Jewish families ended up, again, to use non-triggering language, preempted this rather than having their children fall to the Crusaders. And it's actually interesting to see how the different translations grapple with it. Some try to cover it up. Without going into an arichis right now about who and why. But anyway, so he says, this is something that's happened. It's reflected in the liturgy that we say on Yom Kippur. So what, I'm going to come and say that it's usher and all these people who did this, it was wrong? I'm not ready to do it. So what does he do now? He says, I'm going to bring a raya for heter. What's his raya for heter? What's his raya lahatir? The bahu krok siv. And what's, I'll summarize what is heter. The pasuk in Parashas Noach that tells us that it's a no-no, a person's not allowed to take their own life, and that's where you had ach, which told us shol was good, was an exception. The rest of the pasuk, the continuation of the pasuk, talks about one person murdering another. So the ach, the shol exception, is enforced for the entirety of the pasuk, he says. And so therefore, just like the ach takes off the self-inflicted wound, so too the ach takes off the wound inflicted on another. Presumably he's referring to family, maybe in cases where there's direct permission or implied permission or something like that, or maybe without permission, that I'm not entirely sure. But this is the raya that he says that this is okay. And he concludes the tshuva saying, so Misha Matinai Kapara, if you say that this Jew needs to go through the arduous process of a kapara, you're being moiti lazach sidim rashonim. Rabbanim are very often very worried about this. You're then going to be telling us that our legacy in Ashkenaz, from the First Crusade, at least, until now, into the mid-1200s, you're going to say that a lot of behavior wasn't proper. I'm not ready to say that about these great tzaddikim. And so therefore, you cannot impose upon him a heavy kapara. Ve'in lahachmir olav klal. This is the tshuva of Maram Rottenberg. Now, Rabbi Goren did not quote the tshuva of Maram Rottenberg, but the other sources that we learned along the way, he quoted. And let me summarize how he responds to this young man from Switzerland about how to regard the people at Masada. He says, based on the sources that we saw, if it's a case, and in number 11, I put in bullet points a summary of his response. If it's a case of Avodah Zarah and Arayos, then mitzvah. Meaning he's quoting that word from Tosfos. Not only mutter, but in fact, it's a good thing. It's advisable. Okay. Then he goes and says, yeah, but what about for other people? What about to do it to somebody else? That's what happened in Masada. People took their own lives. They also did it to their families. See, again, as I mentioned, he didn't use the tshuva of Maram Rottenberg. So he came up with his own explanation to say that too should be justified. Why? Because before Shaul took his own life, what did he do? He asked his Arzbir to do it. So if Shaul was okay to do it to himself, and a minute before that he asked someone else to do it to him, so therefore it's a raya that there's no real difference between doing it oneself and asking someone else to do this act of euthanasia. Then he goes on to say, but what if it's stam aveirus? What if it's not avodah zarah and arayos? The chashash is you're going to be captured and tortured into doing other avedas. He learned the toisus that I showed you before, la avera, which I'm pretty confident means la avera, the avera. Rabbi Goren assumed that this is kipshutoi, avedas. And so therefore he went on to say that here, there's also mutter. It's also going to be heter for a person. The same heter that applies to aveda zara and aroyas expands out to apply to any avera. Then he goes on further, and he quotes the Tosfos from Gittin. And remember, the Tosfos in Gittin said, the reason that it was okay for the 400 kids to do what they did is because Yereim hayu miyasurin. Now I insisted when I interpreted that Tosfos, that when you judge it by all the parallel passages, it must mean that they were afraid that Yisurin was going to lead them to Gila Aroyas to Avodah Zarah. Well, he didn't learn the Tosfos that way. He took a Kipshuto Hayereim Miyasurin, and so therefore he innovates that it could be, he's a little more tentative with his language, but he says that if a person is captured and they know that they're going to be killed, and along the way it's going to be unbearable suffering, then, says Rabbi Goren, he thinks there is going to be okay for a person to do this per this Tosfos in Gittin. So, these are the 4 points that Rabbi Goren had to say. Now, Rabbi Moshe Tzvi Neriah was another rabbi from the religious Zionist community at the time, and he responded to Rabbi Goren's article. He didn't respond in Machanayim. What happened is that Rabbi Goren republished his Machanayim article that appeared in Cheshvan Tavshin Yotes. He republished it in a journal that came out in America, Ur HaMizrach, which is a Mizrahi journal, came out in Tammuz Elul Tavshin Chaf. So he republished the same thing. That's where Rabbi Neriah saw it, and Rabbi Neriah was not happy with this article, and Rabbi Neriah responded in Ur HaMizrach in Tavshin Chaf Aleph, in Tevis Tavshin Chaf Aleph. The main point that Rabbi Neriah tried to convey is, this is not just a question of the past. Because if you read Rabbi Goren, you see he's also saying, and so therefore, in the state of Israel in the 1950s, if someone is captured, so this is not only a question of the past, it's also very much a question about current events in the future, and so it's a huge achrayus to make sure that we get this right. And he said, I have a big problem with what Rabbi Goren wrote. His main problem was that Rabbi Goren only presented one side of the Rishonim. So far, if we were to pause the shir right now, you would say, all the Rishonim pretty much agreed. Maybe the Ritva said, I'm not sure. But other than that, pretty much everyone agreed. Said Rabbi Neriah, that's not fair. Look back at the sources and you're going to see that there was a voice in Ashkenaz, maybe it's not a Rabbeinu Tam, but there was a voice in Ashkenaz that said this is wrong, and made a macha, and protested. Let's read inside. Where do you get this from? So there's a collection of the Balei HaTosfos on the Torah, their commentary on the Torah. There's multiple collections. One of them is known as the Das Genim in Balei HaTosfos. The passage that we're going to read is from there. This also appears, the Beis Yosef, when he wrote his Sefer Beis Yosef on the Torah, he also wrote later Hashlamas, and he printed it separately as a book called Bedek HaBayis, which means, you're improving. The first book is Beis Yosef, now you're Bedek HaBayis, you're improving the home. And then in later editions, it was merged into the standard commentary of the Beis Yosef. They put it in right there. So the Bedek HaBayis in Yededeya quotes this same teaching, not from the Das Genim, he quotes it from the Orchos Chaim. Okay, what happens? The Das Genim, first he brings Rabbeinu Tam Shitta, and he brings the Medrash interpreting Shaul is okay, and he's good, and we can learn from it. But then it doesn't end there. There's a continuation. What's the continuation? V'yesh oisrin. There are those who forbid all this activity. Umefarsh and Canaan, they explain the Medrash just the opposite. What does it mean, just the opposite? They read the Medrash like this. The pasuk says, Ach tells you no to the taking of one's own life. Yachal k'Shaul, so you would think that 1 second, Shaul did it, so I'm allowed to do it. Maybe it's okay. Shaul was right. Tamaloimer, no. Read the pasuk again. That this whole Isser applies also to Shaul. That's how you read it. V'Shaul shaloi b'rshus chachamim asa. Not allowed. Presumably, I don't know for sure. They don't address it. The 400 children going to Rome, maybe they would say the same thing. Again, we're not going to judge. Very difficult situation. It's not our job to come and to start distributing labels and things like that. But, lav dafka, that we say that this is a symbol to be held up for all future generations. They're not mefarish about the 400 kids, this shitta, so I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's a reasonable thing to say. And then these sources, all these sources go on to say a story, a horrific story. What's the story? The story is, Ma'aseh barav echad, shashachat harbe tinokos b'shas hashma. There was a rabbi when he was preempting, to use euphemisms. Why? He was afraid they were going to, again, take the children and raise them in monasteries. And there was another rabbi there. There are no names here. He got very mad. The second rabbi did. He looked at the first one and said, you're a murderer. But the first one didn't care. He continued doing what he was doing. So the second rabbi said, if I'm right, you're going to die on Misa Mishuna, is what Rabbi 2 told Rabbi 1. And that's exactly what happened. The Gentiles came, they took this rabbi who was preempting, and then he describes over here how he was tortured, which I'd rather not read inside. And then what happened was that the mob that came, and it looked like they were going to take every single Jew and take the children, guess what? They didn't even end up penetrating wherever the Jews were. And there were many survivors. And one of the most tragic lines to be written in this sugya, and perhaps in any sugya, these children would have been saved if the first rabbi wouldn't have done what he did, which tells you the Das Genim B'Balei Tosos, the Orchos Chaim, the Bedek HaBayis. Why do they tell you that story? What do they want? They want to bias you in which direction? In the second direction. If you're going in the first direction, you don't say this story. This story also has like a miraculous side to it. Because the guy said, you're going to die in Misa Mishuna. If I'm right, and you're wrong, you're going to die in Misa Mishuna. That's exactly what happened. No reader who reads the story walks away saying, so according to Das Genim B'Balei Tosos, this is mutter. According to the Orchos Chaim, this is mutter. According to the Bedek HaBayis, this is mutter. No one comes away from that. What you come away with is there was a view that said it was mutter. Rabbeinu Tam stands his own. We know Rabbeinu Tam is Rabbeinu Tam. But there's another point of view over here. And a very serious point of view. And the collectors who are the editors of these texts, Orchos Chaim, Das Genim B'Balei Tosos, they want you, without saying clearly, Ein halacha ke Rabbeinu Tam, because they're not really comfortable prior to saying those words, they want you, wink, wink, to feel that way. That's I think, the way of reading this. So therefore, says Rav Neriah, I read Rabbi Goren's article, you would never know that this opinion even existed. He doesn't quote it. He doesn't cite it. Now, an excuse for it is, it doesn't appear in Tosos. If you are a Baki B'Shas, and you know Shas, Gemara, Rashi, Tosos, you wouldn't know this. Because Tosos al Hadaf only has the permissive view. So that's the limud chos for Rabbi Goren, that he didn't have the Das Genim B'Balei Tosos. It's not like he was covering it up, but still, you wrote it. And you wrote it Lamaisa. That's a problem. And then he goes further. Says Rav Neriah, let's go a few generations forward. Let's move into the 1500s. One of the greatest achronim living in Poland is Amar Shal Reb Shlomo Luria, the Yam Shel Shlomo. And he has a long shtickle on this in Baba Kama. Let's read what he says. He writes as follows: even if a person is captured in the hands of non-Jews and he's afraid that he's going to be tortured to the extent of eventually doing Avodah Zarah, the person should not take his own life, the Marshal says. Try to endure the torture as much as possible. And by the way, it isn't really the case that we find that the authorities torture until a person converts to Christianity. After all, officially according to them, conversion has to be an act of will, and if it's not an act of will, then it's not really so good. So, Mela threatening with death, fine, even that was officially not tolerated, but fine. But to torture someone, that doesn't turn conversion into an act of will. So says the Marshal, I know what's going on. I don't really think that happens all that often. Of course, there's the other issue that I alluded to before, and that is right now I'm together with 10, 15 Jews and whatever. Later, when I get separated and I take it on my own, maybe the Nisayan, Yehareg Val Yavar, I'm gonna fail. Okay, so the Marshal says, don't. Be strong and don't fail that. Okay. Then he goes on to say, nonetheless, what about Shaul then? So the Rishonim that we just quoted in Das Genim B'Balei Tosos, they were happy saying, Shaul shaloi b'ratzayin chachamim asa. That Shaul, what he did was against what Hashem wanted, was against what the rabbis wanted. The Marshal is not so comfortable with that. Marshal would prefer if we could say Shaul is good, and yet we, living in Christian land, shouldn't learn from him. How do you do that? He proceeded to go along and to say there were two reasons, two heterim, why it was okay for Shaul to do what he did, and it has zero relevance to anyone today. In most cases. What are the two heterim? He says, it's mutter for a person to take their own life to save Rabbim Yisrael, many Jews. He doesn't define what Rabbim Yisrael is, but for someone to take their own lives in order to save Rabbim Yisrael, that's mutter. And that's exactly what Shaul did. How was it Rabbim Yisrael? Very simple, he says. Shaul knew he's going to be captured. Shaul knew that he's also going to die, because the night before he heard from the Navi Shmuel about this. We can't get into the details right now, but if you read the Navi Shmuel, you'll see that definitely Chazal understood the story in that way, that he heard from Shmuel that this is what's going to happen. So he knows he's about to die, and he knows that if he's captured, what's going to happen? Am Yisrael is going to come to try to free him. The king is captured. What's going to happen? They're going to plan an attack that's not well planned, that's doomed to fail. Many Jews are going to die during that attack to save their king. Better that I get captured dead. And so by doing this act, he saved many Yidden. And that made it mutter, is what the Marshal said. The second heter, he says, is a king is different. A king, the symbol of the Jewish people, Mashiach, Hashem, that's different, and so therefore that's taka inappropriate for him to ever be captured, but that doesn't become a lesson for other people. And then the Marshal says, by the way, so if you're not, do it to yourself, Kal v'chomer, don't touch the kids. Kal v'chomer, don't touch anybody else. You're not allowed to do that. Even if they get taken, they'll get taken, they'll come back. They'll come back. We see that Roiv ha'anusim choizrim achar kama shonim. That means majority or many have come back. And so therefore, and children also, sometimes children also, and don't go ahead and don't do this. This is the Marshal writing. I've thought about this Marshal. The Marshal is very much a continuation of the Ashkenaz from France and Germany, very much following their tradition, but you see here he's breaking. He's breaking from them on this issue. And you're able to see, definitely in Maram and Rottenburg, that a huge factor is we live in these people's shadow. How could I say usser? We walk the streets that they walk. We bury in the cemetery where they bury. We see them all the time. They're part of our life. They're in the past, but they're part of our life. How can we be mighty laz on them? Throwing this out there as a possibility. What happens when you move east? What happens when you move to Poland? And yes, you're a continuation of Ashkenazi Jewish community, and the Marshal is very much trying to uphold their traditions as expressed in many ways. But the legacy, so to speak, of these people is now a little more distant. Not only in terms of time, that now you're in the 1500s, but also in terms of place. You're not living, you don't see their cemetery every day. You don't walk, you don't daven in the same shul where these people daven. Maybe it becomes a little easier for the Marshal to look back and say, you know something, full break, let's say no. Okay. Now, says Rav Moshe Tzvi Neriah, so the bottom line is that Rabbi Goren wrote an article. He ignored the dissenting view amongst the Rishonim. He ignored this view from the Marshal. Everything that Rabbi Goren was saying is not fair, he said. Add to that the points that I mentioned, that Neriah doesn't get into. The Rabbi Goren understood the Tosfos that said Yisurin as understanding Yisurin in and of itself. And Rabbi Goren understood the Tosfos that said Aveira, even Aveira in and of itself. And so Rav Goren went back to Masada, and he said that by Masada, it's for sure it was mutter. Why? Because Avodah Zarah, Arayis, Aveiris, Yisurin, yet all of that was in play. And so therefore it was okay for them to do it to themselves, okay to do it to the other, and this is also relevant moving forward in Israel as well. So Rav Neriah is particularly perturbed, not so much about the Masada thing per se, but more about the halacha lemaisa moving forward. Okay. Now, in order to wrap up, there's still a few things that we need to do, so we're going to have to go, unfortunately, a little over today. It's going to take a few minutes. At the end of the day, though, we see very much what happened here, what Rabbi Goren did. We see Rabbi Neriah's hesitation. But at the end of the day, even with Rav Neriya's hesitation, you could still come back and look at the Masada story and say, so is there grounds to say what they did was mutter? The answer is, you could still carve out a yes. Why? Take out the torture, which was Rav Goren's chiddush. Take that out. Take out Aveira, which was his chiddush. Let's focus on Avodah Zarah and Gilui Arayos. And basically the question becomes, would there be a chance that the people, if they would have been captured, would have been subject to Ta'arayos? And if the answer is yes, then there's a heter. Universal? No. But Rabbeinu Tam? Same question. Another question. Would they have been forced in one way or another to serve idolatry? Simple question. And if the answer is yes, so then they have a heter. Universal? No. But they have Rabbeinu Tam's heter. It still exists. Remember, we don't want to say that Rabbeinu Tam's heter doesn't exist. Rav Neriya's taina was, you can't ignore the Yesh Oyser. Okay, so at least you have a footing where these people could stand on, but then you have to answer these historical questions. You have to answer, what are the chances that indeed they would have been subject to Gilui Arayos? And remember, before you run to compare it to the 400 kids, the 400 kids were already on a ship taken for this purpose of being sex slaves. Here, it's a little more remote. They weren't taken yet. All of them, some of them, yeah, you have to study Roman battle tactics to be able to actually answer that question, what would have happened in terms of Arayos for the children, for the men, for the women. That's not for us to do. But at least it's a conversation. And likewise for the Avodah Zarah. Did the Romans force people to Avodah Zarah? Officially, the Romans respected Judaism and recognized Judaism as a valid religion. But does that mean that it wouldn't have happened to force on Avodah Zarah? I don't know. That's a historical question. It's not for me to figure out around this table. So, in summary, what I think you would say about this particular question, or if Yoav, what was his name, Elstein, asked us this question, how would we word it? We would say there was a huge machloikas amongst the Rishonim about this issue, and specifically in the area of Arayos and Avodah Zarah. So, to the extent that this would have been an issue for them, then maybe it was. Then there's a heter, perhaps controversial, but at least a heter. And if you want to know to study this further, go speak to a historian. That's, I think, the right way of formulating the answer to this. However, the truth is that we're asking the wrong question if we focus too much on the act of taking life that happened. Why? So let's remember where we are in history. We're in the year, officially, usually the way the story of Masada is dated, to the year 73. We're after the Churban. The Churban, depending on which number you want to use, 68, 69, 70. So we're after the Churban. Why are there people still fighting on a mountaintop after the Churban? Moreover, when you read the Gemara in Gittin, you see very clearly that even before the Churban, there was already a conflict between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and what the Gemara calls Biryonim, which means hooligans, where Rabbi Yochanan calls them over and says, why are you fighting? This is ridiculous. Not to say that Chazal didn't support the revolt. It could be that they did support the revolt in earlier stages. That's not our topic for today. But definitely when you come toward the latter stages, when the Romans are besieging Yerushalayim and there's a hunger, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, enough. This is ridiculous. Cut it out. And he wants the Biryonim, the hooligans, to stop the revolt. They say no. They're continuing the revolt. So before we focus too much on the act they did on the night which was their last night alive, you need to actually wind back the clock and say, Chazal actually suggested that this fight stop. Not a day before, a week before, a few years before the Churban actually happened. So if we want to look at these people and understand heroes or not, one question is the act of their final night, but the other question is, why are you even there fighting at this point? That's one important factor. But then there's another important factor over here. Where b'chlal do we know this whole story of Masada from? Where do we know this story from? We know this story from one place. From a man named Josephus. That's the way he's generally known in the world. His name was Yosef ben Matisyahu. We can't do too much on him. Be'eretz Hashem, in a future shir, we'll spend more time on him. But really, really b'kitzer. You have a man named Yosef Matisyahu. He's obviously Jewish. He lives in Eretz Yisrael. And he, after the war, wrote a number of books. And he wrote this for the Gentile population to read. There's also a Jewish version of it that the Rishonim had and quoted. And it's a topic for itself to get into where that came from and how. for now, it doesn't matter because the distinction between these, the Gentile version and the Jewish version is irrelevant for today's topic. And Josephus is the one who tells us this story. Now, when this story happened in the year 73, he's in Rome. How does he know this story? So he writes that this night, the last night when they were alive, a few women, 2 women and a few children hid, and so they were spared. They spared, meaning, okay, the other meaning of the word spared, and they did it, they survived, and they told people, who told people, and he was in Rome and he heard the story. All right. So by the way, there are some people who say, I'm not convinced the story ever happened, the whole thing. But let's assume we want to go with the fact that the story is happening. If the story is happening, we're going based on what? That this is what Josephus says happened in the year 73. Okay. Now, if we're listening to that part of him, then we should listen also to the full story. And Josephus in his writings tells us the full story of the revolt of the Jewish people against Rome that happened during the first century of the Common Era. And he begins his story in the year 6. And he says, in the Jewish Wars in Book 2, he says that there was a Yid from the Galil whose name was Yehuda, and he pressed his countrymen to revolt in the year 6 against the Common Era. What happened in the year 6 in the 6 of the Common Era? At that point, for the first time, the Romans made Judea to be a province of Rome, which meant Rome directly ruled it. Earlier, you had Hordas, who was Kavyachol, a king, a shtickle Jewish king, however you want to define him. At least you could look at it and say he's like a Jewish king. But now, Rome became a province of Judea in the year, Judea became a province of Rome in the year 6 of the Common Era. It was a few years after Hordas passed away. And the Rome decided it will be more effective that way. And so now Jews are living under direct Roman rule. So this Galilean wages war and presses his countrymen to revolt. And he said that they were cowards if they would pay a tax to the Romans and submit to mortal masters in addition to their subservience to God. Very interesting religious language here. He said that it was wrong to have a mortal master in addition to Hashem. In other words, it sounds like living under the Romans is somehow gets in the way of a Bein Adam La'amakim relationship with Hashem. That's what this guy was saying in the year 6. Now, nothing came of this in the year 6. The Romans put down the revolt, and that was the end of that. However, Josephus goes on to tell us further that he had a son named Menachem. And his son Menachem was one of the key leaders in the revolt that broke out in 66, which ended in the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So we can draw a direct line from that guy's philosophy of you're not allowed to have another master, a Roman master. And then in another, we can draw a direct line from that to the year 66. And then when we come to, Josephus has multiple books. Till now I was reading from the Jewish War. If you read his Antiquities of the Jews, he writes about this Yehuda, that he agrees with Chazal for all of their teachings. However, he has an attachment to liberty, and he says that Hashem is to be your only ruler and master, and that he's not afraid of any death, he's not afraid of anything, including to refer to any human as their Lord. What do you see here again? The same theme. There's some sort of religious belief or idea that you're not allowed to have a non-Jew, Romans, who are oimed al gabecha. And doing so is like a problem. It gets in your way with relationship with Hashem, and it's a no-no. And then what happens is, remember, I told you his son is a leader, not the only, there were many factions, but a leader in the revolt in 66. And then if you follow Josephus' narrative, which is not easy to do, but if you follow it, you will find that Menachem dies, the guy who takes him over is Elazar ben Yair. Elazar ben Yair is the captain at the top of Masada who gives this rousing speech that says we should all take our lives. And Josephus has this long speech that he puts in his mouth. Presumably, Josephus thought these would be the words he would have said at that time. So let's look and to listen to the words that Josephus thinks this Elazar said then. My loyal followers, long ago we resolved to serve neither the Romans nor anyone else but God, because he alone is the true and righteous Lord. And now the time has come that bids of us to prove our determination indeed. We always held you're not allowed to have another Adain. We've always held that from the year 6. And that's why when Chazal said stop fighting, it was a non-starter. And that's why the Beis HaMikdash has been destroyed for 3 years. So a lot of people said, okay, throw in the towel. We're not throwing in no towel because this has been a firm belief of ours. Until today, we have never submitted to servitude, even when it brought no danger with it. We must not choose servitude now, and with it the penalties awaiting us if we fall alive into the hands of the Romans. So, yes, he mentions over here the penalties awaiting us. Yeah, the Romans are going to be mean to us when they capture us. But that's not the main thrust of his argument. The main thrust of his argument is you're not allowed to live under Romans. Okay. This idea has parallels in Chazal. There are Chazal teachings that seem to indicate, because on the face of it we think of like, what? You could be very loyal to Hashem and live under the Romans. We've been doing that for a very long time in Golos, right? So where is this even coming from? But there's multiple teachings that actually get really close to this. Teaching number one, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, why do we drill the ear of the person who says he wants to remain a slave after 6 years? Because he heard the pasuk in this week's Parsha, Parshas Bahar, Kili b'nei Yisrael avodim. You got to be my servant, Hashem says. And you went and you took another servant? What's a stira? What's a stira? You took another master? So I'm asking, it's a contradiction? God, I have one God, and now I have an Adon. No, it gets in the way. It gets in the way. And so when you do it willingly, we go to that ear and we pierce the ear. That's teaching number one. Teaching number two, the Yerushalmi says, Avodim are pater from Krishma, but Pashas means Eved Knani. They're pater from Krishma. How do we know? Because what's Krishma? It says Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That only applies to a regular Jew. Yatza Eved. You don't have Hashem Echad. You don't have Hashem Echad, you have Adon Acher. What do you mean you don't have Hashem Echad? God is one God, and then there's also a master I have. No, it gets in the way. Adon, having a human being who tells you where to go, what to do, what to work, to do all those things, gets in the way, infringes on the loyalty that a person has to Hashem. Very similar to Rabbi Yochanan's teaching. Number three, this is more famous. Why don't we say Halal on Purim? Why don't we say Halal on Purim? Says Rava in the Gemara, I believe it's Rava. The opening words of Halal are Halalu Avdei Hashem. Now we're servants of Hashem. That makes sense when you leave Mitzrayim. Now you're Avdei Hashem. But after the miracle of Purim, Akati Avdei Achashverosh, and you're still living under Achashverosh. You're not Avdei Hashem. You're Avdei Hashem a little, but Avdei Hashem light. Why? Because you're living under Achashverosh. Here again you see there's this idea that having someone who has legal authority over you gets in the way of you being loyal to Hashem. Now we could try to sit here and explain how this works, but rather not do that. What I rather say is that this idea that we see Josephus presenting in the year 6, and it's presumably presented relevant in the revolt, and we see it on the hilltop of Masada in the year 73, is this attitude that you see from Chazal. There is this idea, you're living under the Romans? That's a problem for what? For your loyalty to Hashem. It gets in the way of your relationship with Hashem. Where's the difference? Chazal never said that this amounts to Avodah Zarah. Chazal never said that Avodah Zarah is Yehareg Val Yavar, so to this, Kili b'nei Yisrael Avodim is Yehareg Val Yavar. It would seem, again, the only reason to believe this story is for Josephus. So once you're doing it, go all the way. And Josephus seems to be telling us that they believed Yehareg Val Yavar for the pasuk Kili b'nei Yisrael Avodim, because it's the same thing. It's about your relationship with Hashem. You can't have a Roman master. You can have only one boss, God. Mela, a Jewish king. Fine, a Jewish king is there to bring you closer to Hashem. You're going to think a Roman, a pagan king is going to... No, not happening. Even a Jewish king maybe is questionable in their view because something to explore. But I don't want to go there. But at the very least, a non-Jewish king, which is why the revolt first broke out in the year 6 when they made Judea a province of Rome. So now you understand why they're fighting in the year 73. And now you understand why they believe this is a matter of life and death, just like Avodah Zarah is a matter of life and death. This is an addendum to the Isser of Avodah Zarah. And so, they crossed that line. They said Yehareg Val Yavar, which then eventually turned into what? Yaroig Val Yavar. Okay, so now if we want to come back to this question, how you view them, it's too narrow to only look at it through the sugya that Rabbi Goren chose to look at it. That's not the whole story. You have to also look, you have to ask the more fundamental question, why are you on that mountaintop in the year 73? Chazal don't want you there. And you have an interpretation of halacha that seems to be the hepech of how Chazal understood things already then. And so therefore, that definitely has to color how you view them and their legacy. Okay, so I'm just going to conclude now by sharing the following, and that is the Chidah. The Chidah has a passage in where he discusses this idea of Akati Avdei Achashverosh Hanan, and he says, I dislike this. Einoi meruvach. I don't like this idea from Rava that we don't say Hallel on Purim because we're not Avdei Hashem. Now remember, Chidah lives in Golus. This idea that your relationship with Hashem is somehow compromised because you're living in Golus, that's a very hard thing to hear. And the Chidah says, I want to fight back. I want to fight back against Rava, which is not so usual for an Acharon to do against an Amoira. But he says, I don't understand. If anything, we're more Avdei Hashem. We live in Golus. There are other forces that dictate what we could and what we can't do. There's a lot of temptation, a lot of nisyonis, and yet we remain loyal to Hashem. We're Ershta Avdei Hashem, the Chidah writes in Machzik Bracha. We're the real Avdei Hashem. And so therefore he says, the Rambam, when he explains why you don't say Hallel on Purim, doesn't bring this reason. Why? Because I don't like this reason. I don't like this reason. So is the Chidah denying that it exists in Chazal? No, Chidah recognizes that this concept exists in Chazal, but he's happy to say that it's not the halacha. Because you want to know what halacha is? Halacha is, you can find a mila, yes, there's a mila in purity. There's a mila when a person has one boss. There's a mila when there's only one. I wake up in the morning, I know I'm answerable to one entity and one entity alone. There's a mila that's more pure. But on the other hand, there's something that's very, very fascinating and rich about someone who has a conflict and someone who gets pulled in multiple directions and Alpha became their loyal, says, Yichida, you're the real Eved Hashem. Okay. And if you want to bring that a little bit into the world of Yisachar and Zvulun, I think you could do that too. Yisachar is more loyal to Hashem, all day Torah, right? But there's something to be said about Zvulun, that split personality. Someone who, yes, he's learning a little Torah and he's davening, but maybe it's not as pure. But wow, is it more powerful? I think the Chidah would say that Alpha became that person, remained loyal to Hashem. So I think that's a small takeaway we could try to think about in addition to this much broader sugya.